welcome you to Sunday School with Metropolitan Baptist Tabernacle. Metropolitan is located at 930 East Myrtle Avenue in Flint, Michigan, 48505. Reverend Stephen L. Murphy Sr. is our pastor. Please join me for prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together. Please grant us wisdom, clarity, and a spirit of cooperation for this time. Guide our thoughts and actions to bring glory to your name. Amen. Today, September the 21st, our lesson subject is God values justice. Does God care about social justice? Our focus verses are from Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 18, and 33 through 37. Our aim for change. By the end of the lesson, we will identify what it means to love one neighbor as oneself. We'll also reflect on ways to act with compassion and pray to live a life of justice and compassion. Our keep in mind verse says, "But the strangers that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Leviticus 19:34. As we dive into this lesson, our first part is Leviticus 19:9 through 18 verses, and then we will look at, if time allows, 33 through 37. When we think about justice, many of us may picture a courtroom or judge with a gavel. But in today's lesson, we see that justice is much bigger, that it's about how we live with one another every day. In Leviticus 19, God reminds his people that being holy isn't just about sacrifices or ceremonies. It's also about being fair, honest, and compassionate. He tells them to leave food for the poor, to treat neighbors with love, and even to care for the strangers. Justice in God's eyes means making sure everyone is treated with dignity and kindness. As we look at this passage, let's consider how God calls us to practice justice in our homes. Oh, thank you. Our communities, and even in small everyday choices. My opening statement for this morning for Leviticus 19, verses 9 through 18. Leviticus 19, 9 through 18 teaches that holiness is seen in how we treat one another. How we treat one another. So we have to be careful how we treat one another. God tells his people to be generous, to be honest, to be fair, and compassionate, reminding us that love for him is proven in love for others. The command to love thy neighbor as thyself stands at the center of this passage and points us to a life where faith is lived out in everyday actions. Let's take a look at our aim for change. My first point is understand God's instructions on justice, on fairness, and compassion. Recognize that holiness is lived out in how we treat others. Holiness is lived out in how we treat others. Excuse me. Commit to practicing generosity, honesty, fairness, and respect in everyday life. In focus, imagine a neighborhood where people share food with those who are struggling. Employers pay workers on time. Courts don't favor the rich or the poor, but they judge fairly. No one gossips or tries to harm another. That's the kind of community God envisioned for his people in the book of Leviticus. As we begin to look at our Leviticus verses 9 through 18 in the 19th chapter of Leviticus, my opening statement teaches that holiness is seen in how we treat one another. How we treat one another is holiness. God tells his people to be generous, to be honest, to be fair, and compassionate, reminding us that for him is proven in love for others. The command to love thy neighbor as thyself stands at the center of this passage, and it points us, you and I, to a life where faith is lived out in everyday action. Our focal verses starts with Leviticus, the 19th chapter, the 9th verse, and I'm going to read the verses. The 9th verse says, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest." The 10th verse, "And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and strangers. I am the Lord your God." Verse 11, "Ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither one to another." The 12th verse, "And ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." Our 13th verse says, "Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning." The 14th verse reads, "Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear thy God. I am the Lord." Verse 15, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor." Verse 16, "Do not spread slanderous gossip among your people, neither shalt thou stand against the blood of the neighbor. I am the Lord." So let's take a look at what verses 9 through 16 under the theme of social justice, treating others right. Caring for the poor and the stranger is our topic, and that takes care of verses 9 through 10. Here we see Israel was commanded not to harvest every corner of the field or pick up all the leftovers. Instead, they were to leave some for the poor and the foreigners. Now, this shows God's concern for economic justice and dignity. The poor didn't have to beg. They could gather food for themselves. I'm hoping you understand that, because if they left some in the field, then they could go and gather it for themselves. Our application for these verses are: we are called to build systems that care for the vulnerable and avoid selfish hoarding. The second phase of our lesson today talks about honesty and integrity, verses 11 to 12. In verses 11 to 12, our commands include not stealing, not lying, and not deceiving one another. They were also forbidden to swear falsely by God's name. This shows how trust, honesty, and respect for God are the foundation of a just society. Now, our application for those verses is: social justice means telling the truth, being trustworthy in business and relationships, and honoring God in word and deed. Verses 13 and 14 talks about fairness to workers. And I'm sure that some of us have had opportunities to have to work in situations where there were not fairness. So this particular theme is fairness to workers and the disabled. And if you're looking, you have your book, it's in verses 13 through 14. Employers were not to cheat workers out of their wages or delay payment. Laborers depended on daily pay to survive. They were also told not to curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. This is both literary and symbolic. Never take advantage of someone's weakness. So if you know someone, there's some weak areas there, don't take advantage of that. That's what this particular verse is saying to us. Our application on these verses is: justice means protecting the rights of workers, uplifting the marginalized, and ensuring accessibility and fairness. Now, God's justice includes generosity and dignity. And the theme for verses 11 through 12 is honesty in all things. Don't steal, don't lie, or don't deceive. Don't misuse God's name to cover dishonesty. Protecting the vulnerable, verses 13 through 14. Pay workers fairly and promptly. Some of you might have been in experiences, especially back in our younger days, where we worked with people and they really didn't pay us what we were worth. I'm sure even as young as I am, I went through some of that. So we kind of know about that situation. So protecting the vulnerable, which was in verses 13 and 14, saying that we pay workers fairly and promptly. Don't take advantage of the disabled. Justice means treated everyone with dignity. And in verses, 15 through 16, it talked about impartial justice. No favoritism for the rich or the poor. Don't slander or endanger others. True justice is fair, is protective, and impartial. Here are some questions that I want to throw out to you. My first one is, why do you think God commanded Israel to leave food for the poor and foreigners? Well, biblical scholars and theologians point to several interconnecting reasons for God's command to the Israelites to leave food for the poor and foreigners, and primarily rooted in the theme of compassion. Remembers justice and the acknowledgement that God is the ultimate provider. A reflection of God's character. The command demonstrated that Israel were to reflect God's own nature, which shows love, and it provides for those who are marginalized. In verses 17 and 18, these verses show that true justice is not just about external actions, laws, fair treatment. It begins with the condition of the heart. God commands his people not to harbor hatred, grudges, or a spirit of vengeance. Instead, he wanted them to love and be forgiven. Show governs the inner life. Those two things, love and forgiveness, should govern the inner life. Social justice in the biblical sense flows from hearts that are purified from bitterness and filled with compassion. Point 3 is replacing vengeance with love. And this we find in verse 18. Rejects retaliation and grudges. Justice is distorted. When people act out of revenge or personal anger, instead, God sets a higher standard. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm sure we all have heard that many times. When individuals treat others with the same dignity, care, and fairness they desire for themselves, justice naturally takes root in families, communities, and nations. So social justice starts in the heart because it flows from the inner transformation of God's people. Without love, honesty, and forgiveness at the personal level, laws and systems will remain corrupt. So remember in Matthew 22:39, showing that the command to love your neighbor is central to God's vision of righteousness and justice. The last two verses in our first set talks about social justice. And social justice, these verses tells us, starts in the heart. And that's in verses 17 through 18. Verse 17 reads, "Do not nurse hatred in your heart, for any of your relatives confront people directly, so you will not be held guilty for their sin." Verse 18 says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So these two verses, social justice, starts where? It starts in the heart. In these verses, we are told, don't hate and don't seek revenge. Now, we know that we have a hard time sometimes doing those things because we sometimes hate and we sometimes seek revenge. But Jesus was clear when he commanded to love even one's what? Enemies. In Matthew 5:43 through 44. Which would more than encompass these verses, speaking primarily about a neighbor. And we know the saying about love your neighbor as yourself. The second greatest commandment is reiterated in both testaments and reinforced by Jesus and others. This is presented as one of several positive laws, but it captures the heart of the holiness code. All the law codes, nothing better defines the child of God or social justice than loving one's neighbor as oneself. We have heard that, I'm sure all of us from a child, love your neighbor as yourself. If we look at the last set of our verses, if you have your book, and it's called Social Justice Cares for Strangers, verses 33 through 34. The 33rd verse reads, "Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land." 34, "Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners, living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Strangers are sojourners, travelers. Strangers may also be immigrants or foreigners. And God's children are to treat them as they would be, again, invoking the second greatest commandment. This clarifies beyond question the New Testament rhetorical question, who is my neighbor? Luke 10:29. The answer is abundantly clear. Everyone, no one are excluded from the law. As the various specific examples clarified, whether they are visitors just passing judgment, in meter yard, in weight, or in measure. And our 36th verse says, just balances, just weights, a just ephod, and a just hand shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. The 37th verse says, therefore shall you observe all my statutes and all my judgment, and do them. I am the Lord. So as we move to the last set of verses in our lesson today, Leviticus 19:35 through 37, our theme is social justice, fairness in business and law. Now these verses call for honest scales and just measures in a world where cheating and exploitation were common. God commanded his people to be different. Integrity in business, dealing, and fairness in judgment, all of this reflects God's own character. In Proverbs 11:1, it says, false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. Justice is not only in the courts, but also in everyday exchanges, treating people honestly in trade and in decision making. As I move closer to my closing statement in regards to today's lesson, Leviticus 19:9 through 18 and 33 through 37, we find that Leviticus 19 shows us that holiness is practical. It touches how we treat the poor, the strangers, our neighbors, and even how we handle money and business. God's call to his people is a call to live set apart. We are to show love, justice, and fairness. Not in just a few things, but in all the things that we do. And we are especially asked to do it in loving our neighbors. And we know the saying that love our neighbors as ourselves. We also should do it in caring for the strangers. That was in verse 34 of our lesson. And in practicing honesty in every area of life, verse 36 of our lesson. We reflect the heart of God. True holiness is not only in worship, but in the daily practice of justice, mercy, and love. So as we are coming down to a close of this lesson, I wanted to just look at verses 35 through 36, which talks about verse 36, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meter yards, in weight, or in measure. Verse 36, just balances, just weights, a just ephod, and a just hand shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Verse 37, therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord. So let's just look at a little bit of an explanation of these. Number one, fairness in judgment. God commands his people not to be unjust in their judgments. This applies to court cases, community decisions, or even small disputes. Justice must not be based by wealth, by status, or personal preference. Everyone should be treated equally under God's standards. Honesty and business weights and measure. In ancient times, trade relied on weights, measures, and scales. A dishonest merchant could cheat in ancient times. Trade relied on weights. They could cheat. Customers by using false weights. God is saying to us, do not cheat people, whether in buying, selling, or trade. Your business dealings should reflect honesty, integrity, and fairness. This applies today in contracts, in pricing, pay, taxes, and financial dealings. The third point of my explanation is justice rooted in God's God's character. He commands us to use weights. It's not just about economics. It's about reflecting God's holiness. God reminds Israel that he delivered them from Egypt, so they must live differently from nations among them. Their integrity in business and law was a witness to God's justice. Social justice connection. True justice goes beyond the courtroom. True justice goes beyond the courtroom. It touches daily lives. When people are cheated in business or oppressed by unfair laws, the whole community suffers. By commanding fairness, God is protecting the poor, the strangers, and the everyday workers. Social justice here means building a community where truth, fairness, and trust are the foundation. Now, if we look at our modern applications in law, we are to treat all people equally, regardless of race, class, or background. In business, be fair in pricing, wages, contracts, and services. No exploitation, no deception. And in everyday life, honor your word. Act with integrity. And remember that God cares about the small details of fairness. So my takeaway for you on this lesson today, social justice means making sure on legal systems and business practices reflect honesty and fairness. God's people are called to live with integrity in all dealings because it shows his justice to the world. And in Leviticus 19:35 through 37, my last thought is that it teaches us that justice is not just for the courtroom, it's for everyday life. God calls us to be fair in how we treat others and how we do business and how we uphold the law. Honest measures and just decisions protect the vulnerable and reflect God's own character. When we walk in integrity, we show the world that our God is righteous and just. I hope that there was something said that will stick with you from my overview of this lesson. Are there any comments or anything before I close this out? Okay. If not, Brother Frank, that is my spin on today's lesson. And thank all of you for helping us to get started here. And so we appreciate that. Okay, so I am finished.